also first like to thank Professor Amy Friedman and the other organizers of this conference who have made this possible. I'm the only Southeast Asianist in my department, so I'm always amazed that there are actually more of us, so it's quite wonderful. So I think Josh's paper actually set the tone for my paper very nicely, despite the fact that I'm mainly working anthropologically rather than historically, but I'm talking about one of the two organizations that Josh just talked about in his presentation. I just came back from field research in Java that I did for the last academic year, so this is all pretty new, and I'm looking forward to feedback to help me think through some of these things. At their General Assembly in 2010, Muhammadiyah, Indonesia's largest modernist Islamic mass organization, celebrated their 100-year anniversary in Yogyakarta, the city where Kiai Haji Ahmed Dahlan founded the organization in 1912. This anniversary was an occasion for Muhammadiyah to celebrate the successes of the organization in the course of their history, and to commemorate the lives of the Muhammadiyah activists who had come before them, especially Kiai Haji Ahmed Dahlan and his first wife, Siti Walida, who is often remembered as the mother of Aishia, the women's movement within the organization. Ahmed Dahlan, according to a brochure published by the central leadership of Muhammadiyah at the occasion of the anniversary, quote, would perhaps just have been a small dot in the history of Indonesia if he had lived a life as a batik trader and a preacher at the Sultan's Mosque of Yogyakarta. But in fact, he did not remain a small dot in history. Instead, he became a presence through great ideas that brought illumination in the midst of the nation's sorrowful fate under the yoke of colonialism. Since the 100-year anniversary, the founders of the movement have increasingly become a topic of historical interest and pious inspiration. But the same Muhammadiyah brochure reminds the reader only a few pages later, quote, the cult of individuals in religious matters, which used to be prominent in society, has been eradicated in the environment of Muhammadiyah. Muhammadiyah does not recognize that there is any Superman in the leadership of the movement. Even as Ahmed Dahlan's life and accomplishments are celebrated, his status as a Superman is denied in order to avoid what the modernist movement worked so hard to stamp out, what they call shirk, the fetishization of objects or people, as though they had an unusual agency or proximity to God. No, that wasn't. Oh yeah, that's right, okay. In this paper, I will unravel some of the ideological threads that intersect in the memory practices of Muhammadiyah around their founding figures. And here you see the pictures that have become pretty canonical of Ahmed Dahlan and his first wife, Siti Walida. If you see pictures of them, it tends to be these two pictures. I argue, drawing on my ethnographic field research among Muhammadiyah activists in Yogyakarta, I argue that this ambivalence around memory is produced by the wide currency of two conflicting fundamental anxieties that characterize the movement today. On the one hand, the anxiety of forgetting the history of the organization, especially the struggle of the first activists, and thereby losing the organization's original zeal and identity, which distinguish it from other organizations that have emerged since the fall of the New Order. And on the other hand, the fear of fetish and shirk through an undue veneration of historical leaders, something that is often criticized from within Muhammadiyah with regard to the practices of traditionalist Muslims in Indonesia. These anxieties, which reflect core impulses in Muhammadiyah's mission, appear to be in a relationship of tension or even contradiction. However, I will argue that these two impulses are dependent on and even legitimize each other, such that the contradictions that arise at the intersection between them enable an articulation of certain moderate identity and positioning. In his discussion of cultural memory, Asman has argued that the codification of memory often points to a crisis. And indeed, during my field research, many Muhammadiyah activists expressed to me that they have a sense of living through a time of crisis, or at least serious challenges. I would often ask people what, in their opinion, the greatest challenges for Muhammadiyah were today. In all cases, people were either concerned about the quality of membership in Muhammadiyah, such that people had different priorities or lacked discipline, they were no longer properly socialized according to the organization's ideals, or they were concerned about the number of members and worried that they had been losing their constituents over the last few years. These anxieties reflect the changing political and social circumstances of the last 2 decades. The collapse of Suharto's New Order regime in May 1998 resulted in democratic reforms and the emergence of a more complicated political landscape. The end of the New Order's repressive security measures provided the opportunity for formerly marginalized religious or ideological groups to emerge in the public sphere, propagate their beliefs, and recruit members. These included transnational radical Islamic groups promoting strict monotheism, the purification of Islam, and the cultivation of a pious subject. The Islam-based party PKS, with genealogical ties to the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, recruited members by infiltrating established organizations, including Muhammadiyah, thereby bringing serious damage and significant loss of constituents to the organization. The current leadership of Muhammadiyah has repeatedly distanced itself from such transnational organizations, calling them fundamentalists, among other things, and advocating instead what they call a moderate Islam. On the other hand, some of my interlocutors were aware that there are significant overlaps in the ideological contours between Muhammadiyah's modernism and Islamist groups, with both promoting a return to the Quran and the Sunnah and fighting shirk, as well as their emphasis of charitable work. This shared ideological ground, one Muhammadiyah activist and university lecturer explained to me, makes us vulnerable for either having our members recruited by other organizations or for drifting too far to the right ourselves. The threat of radical Islam as a competitor, according to her, has caused Muhammadiyah to cultivate memory practices to strengthen group cohesion and identity, although she admitted that this was rarely made explicit in Muhammadiyah discourse. Memory is not the only practice that has been activated to strengthen and propagate Muhammadiyah's program. Several scholars, including Nakamura and Hilman Latif, have observed that in Java since the mid-1990s, alongside the trend of purification, a new counter or parallel trend of Javanization has been developing within Muhammadiyah itself. One major benchmark in this increased acceptance of local culture occurred in 2002, when Muhammadiyah agreed upon and subsequently institutionalized a program called Dakwah Kultural Muhammadiyah, or the Cultural Dakwah of Muhammadiyah. Some, especially the younger generation of Muhammadiyah activists, welcomed this increased openness toward culture and art, but there were also critics, especially among the older generation, who resisted the idea. The threat of superstition and shirk, they argued, was still alive and needed to be contained rather than encouraged through the use of cultural forms of da'wah. As we will see, a similar ambivalence exists around memory practices. Muhammadiyah's increased appreciation of historical awareness emerged around the same time as the beginnings of the opening up toward culture, although it did not have much of a platform until the 2010 General Assembly in Yogyakarta. Since then, Muhammadiyah has pursued several initiatives to educate their members about their history and to keep alive the memory of their founders. These include, among others, a Muhammadiyah museum, which is scheduled to be opened this November in Jogja, an initiative called Muhammadiyah Heritage Trip, where groups from outside Yogyakarta are guided through the quarters of the city that are of historical interest for the history of Muhammadiyah, publications about the history of Muhammadiyah in the organization's journals and their book press, and through the production of historical films. In the following, I will focus on the example of the guided walking tours through Kauman, the Yogyakarta neighborhood where Ahmed Dahlan lived for most of his life and where the organization was founded. Muhammadiyah Heritage Trip has existed since 2010, when a group of activists were approached by the leadership and were asked to put together a tourist package for Muhammadiyah visitors to Yogyakarta. One of the tour guides, who had been with the initiative from the start, explained to me that the leadership had felt that there was a need for people to know more. The material historical remnants of the history of Muhammadiyah, he said, were expected to increase motivation and enthusiasm for the organization. This process he called ideological charging. In order to make history tangible and interesting, they decided to develop a walking tour where a tour guide leads the group to certain historical landmarks, including the Great Mosque, the first elementary school, the prayer house for women, and of course the Langgar Kidul, where Ahmed Dahlan lived and taught his students. The very last stop on the tour is the Kauman graveyard, where Siti Walida is buried. When Ahmed Dahlan died in 1923, he was buried in Karangkajen, which is a neighborhood to the south of Kauman. but his wife, who outlived him by more than 20 years, was buried in Kauman, where she had spent her whole life. The graveyard has since been closed for additional burials and most visitors, for reasons that I will discuss shortly, although the tour guides of Muhammadiyah Heritage Trip have permission to take groups inside. As scholars of memory studies have noted, memory sites and memory practices are central loci for ongoing struggles over group identity and ideology. For Muhammadiyah, such struggles are not just about what to remember, but perhaps more crucially about whether to remember at all, and if so, how. Encapsulating their ambivalence with the commemoration of history more generally, Muhammadiyah is navigating conflicting agendas and anxieties when working out how to deal with graves, especially the graves of their famous historical figures when they become destinations of pilgrimage or ziyarah. Many of my younger interlocutors found ziyarah beneficial, and many had even participated in organized tours through their Muhammadiyah youth groups to the grave of Ahmed Dahlan or others. Echoing what the tour guide had told me, they found that their visit has helped them to concretely recall the history and ideology of the organization of which they were a part. On the other hand, especially the older Muhammadiyah activists I spoke with tended to have reservations. While they agreed that ziyarah did not necessarily need to amount to shirk as long as the dead were not addressed in prayer and the ceremony was kept to a minimum, they often found ziyarah to be a temptation that could lead to accidental acts of shirk, or they simply found it unnecessary. After all, one of them told me, you can just pray at home. Graves are places like any other. The dead are gone. The graveyard of Kauman is in a sense a witness to the belief in the finality of death in modernist Islam. Much of it has been abandoned. The graves are overgrown by weeds, some gravestones have fallen over, the inscriptions have become illegible, and the jungkuk, this thing here, the thing that looks like a house in the picture on the left, the house-like structures that were built on top of some of the graves are in different stages of collapse. Located in one corner of the graveyard, Siti Walida's grave is better cared for than the others, but just a few feet beyond it, nature has taken over. On one occasion last March, when I entered the graveyard with a group of teachers of a Muhammadiyah middle school in East Java, one teacher was visibly shaken by the state of the cemetery where the beloved founding figure of Aishia was buried. "Why isn't it cared for better?" she asked as she knelt down at the side of the grave. At first, our tour guide explained that the Jurukunchi, or the caretaker of the graveyard, was already old and wasn't capable of keeping the graveyard clean. Then, a bit hesitantly, he continued, "I'm not sure, but there used to be people who came on ziyarah to this one grave here, and they fetishized it. Therefore, the people of Kauman decided to put an end to it by closing the cemetery down." On a different occasion, another tour guide was less hesitant. "Unfortunately, there are people who were irresponsible," he said. "They came to the graves and asked the dead for all sorts of things. When I asked him if the neglect of the graveyard was deliberate, he just said, 'Of course.'" At the time I was with the group of teachers, no one felt like this was a good solution. Someone in the group said that it was sad to see the grave like this. "Yes," our tour guide agreed. "Whenever I bring visitors here, they get sad. But what can we do?" Then he pointed to Siti Walida's grave, commented that at least her grave was sufficiently well cared for, and continued with his presentation. "I always tell visitors to measure the height of the stone slabs enclosing the grave. It's less than a handspan. It's a properly Islamic grave." In his work on Sumbani's Calvinists, Webb Keane has drawn on Bruno Latour's notion of purification as being an intrinsic concern of modernist ideologies. Purification, according to Latour, is the separation of humans and things and the relegation of metaphysics from the public sphere to the individual's heart. Purification, or pemurnian in Indonesian, has also long been one of the main goals of Muhammadiyah, as is apparent in the narrativization of their history and the life and memory of its founder. There is no Superman, and graves have no intrinsic power. But Keane agreed with Latour, a full purification is bound to fail because the materiality of semiotic form is inescapable. An overgrown cemetery with decaying graves and its low stone slabs, less than a handspan in height, are material expressions of a detachment from materiality, an emphatic performance of a rejection. The paradoxical reliance on materiality to reject the religious significance of materiality is further complicated by the organization's recent and controversial promotion of memory as a way to strengthen group identity and ideology. The group is materially memorializing a site of purification from materiality. Since its beginnings with Ahmad Dahlan, Muhammadiyah has differentiated itself from traditionalist Islam through their commitment to purity and faith from shirk. However, over the last decade, Muhammadiyah activists have increasingly expressed the need to cultivate memory and attachment to people and places that have shaped its historical trajectory and contributions in order to distinguish themselves from the Islamist groups that they reject. These two impulses are in tension, if not fundamental opposition, but they also legitimize each other, counterbalancing Muhammadiyah's tightrope walk between the traditionalist and Islamist discourses from which it distances itself. The middle school teachers kneeling at Siti Walida's grave and her dissatisfaction with the decay of the cemetery is safe in an environment where purification has been accomplished and continues to be staged through deliberate neglect, where it is measurable and measured by the height of the stone slabs. In this context, it cannot be mistaken for what the tour guide referred to as irresponsible or traditionalist practice. Likewise, the cemetery's caretaker's performance of purifying neglect would be meaningless if not for the impact it makes on those who come to, if not do ziyarah, at least perform memory. What might seem like the anticlimactic failure of the Muhammadiyah heritage trip might in fact be a successful performance of the mutual dependence of these two impulses, as the different currents within the organization position themselves vis-à-vis the other. By themselves, either of these practices would run danger of tipping Muhammadiyah's delicate balance between rival ideologies, traditionalism and Islamism, but together they stabilize it. Thank you.